you have like a sixth sense, you get like visions, you get dreams, you're sort of a chosen one, and then, well, presto, you become a witch. So did that happen for you?
Well, I think actually, it's difficult to say when you realise that you are, have these kind of a difference or a different way of looking at life. I always remember as a child, I had various questions like, in an interview recently, somebody said, how did you get involved in paganism in the first place? And I said, well, actually, it started probably when I was about 8 years old, that I can actually remember thinking things like, where did the souls of dinosaurs go to? And I felt like the church, I was at a church school, and I couldn't get answers to these very basic questions, like where do all these souls go to? So in my own mind, I kind of created this idea of a world where, okay, all the dinosaurs probably came back as people. So I think at that time as a child, you invent your own stories. But are you actually inventing your own stories? I think in the end, you realise as a child, you've probably got the answers. But like we saw in the film, you really have to go into yourself. And also, there's a sense of trust as well, that what you're actually experiencing is actually your world. And I think this is the really important thing, is that people have to, in a sense, recapture their own faith in themselves. It's like saying, and I think that when the older lady, when the grandmother said, you have to find it within you. In fact, that's one of the tenets we have in Wicca, is if you can't find it within you, you'll never find it without you, or beyond you. So I think this is one of the things that made me realise, and one of the things I really wanted to become, most people say, what do you want to become? You want to become a teacher. And I always wanted to be a priestess. Not a male or female priest, I wanted to be a classic priestess. And I think that was the journey as well, to find this way of maybe being the messenger between the gods and people. I think this drove me actually to the idea of looking at myths and stories about wise women. And this is, the film we're going to be seeing after the break actually is we were going to be talking about it anyway, but if we don't mind talking about it first, in Hagazusa, you actually see this idea of the classically the woman who lives kind of at the edge of the forest and between the worlds. And this was actually the thing that I realised quite early on, that if I really wanted to be a priestess, then I would have to find some way in the modern world to walk between the worlds. And again, even in the changeover, you see there is always this idea of looking at the different elements. One of the things you see very often is we have to learn to work with the elements. And of course, in both films, you actually see how the woman in this case actually has this experience in water. And I think this was for me, it's actually quite interesting when you look at the second film, notice how the elements also play a very important part. And of course, how could it be different? The moon. The moon that guides us, and all life forces, the power of the moon which can change things, but also has power over and influence on the tides. And considering most of us, if we're all humans here, then we're more or less like 80-90% water, that the moon has such an effect on us, male or female, or everything in between. And I think this is, again, something that you see in both films, the actual sense of responding to nature in a way that perhaps we've become disconnected with. But there's something about all of us which we cannot escape things like the effects of the moon. And I think, again, this is something these two films also bring through, the power of nature. Even though we think we can control nature by having central heating in winter rather than putting on an extra jumper, in the end, we cannot. We have to learn, in many cases, learn again how to live and connect with nature.
So you said elements, nature. We were talking about the water in the changeover. Well, the title is already is telling you that there is a change. There is a sort of ritual in this movie. It's almost like what we know as like a Christian element of baptism. You were talking about when you realized how you wanted to live your life. What sort of rituals did you encounter? What sort of rituals are there in modern witchcraft?
It's interesting that you talk about the ritual of baptism. In the ancient world, it wasn't just the rituals or actual immersion in water, but all through the different elements. So you see in Greek initiations or the mysteries that there wasn't just the water. But I think, and I hope not to offend any Christians here, but many of the rituals that the church have adopted have come from pagan practices. And I wouldn't even say they were pagan practices. I would just say they are actually, again, responding to natural processes. So when Christianity started becoming more and more popular, many of the things which we already knew, and many of the wise women and wise men knew, were actually already present. And often, one of the reasons that the Wicca is called or referred to as the old religion was because Christianity is the new religion. But many of, and often we hear that the devils of the new religion are actually of the old religion. But in fact, when you really start looking at church practices, rituals, whether they're Islamic or Jewish or Christian, that there are so many things which are still, again, referring back to much earlier period. I find it interesting, especially if you look at the Orthodox Church. I was recently, again, in an Orthodox church, and it was just so, the rituals and the richness of it's just amazing, you know. And I still think many people, especially Catholics, will recognise that there are elements of ritual which just speak to it at such a deeper level. And for a Christian, of course, it's this kind of conversation with God or with Jesus. But for many of us, it's actually, again, a communication with the goddess or the many gods or nature spirits.
And we saw in the changeover as well that often those changes, those rituals, have to do also with sexuality. For instance, we saw that quite clearly in this movie. We have some images of rituals from the documentary that it's, what's it called in English?
Witches in Holland.
Witches
Yes.
in Holland. Same as in Dutch. Can you tell me a bit about that, about those rituals specifically for females that have to do with sexuality and the way that is incorporated in your Wicca?
First of all, these screenshots are actually from a project we had when we were celebrating our 35th anniversary from Silver Circle. And in the documentary, we tried to reflect the 8 festivals of the year which we celebrate. As I say, it's a seasonal cycle. So this particular one which we're looking at now is the actual Beltane festival, which is around about the 1st of May, which is why we chose it actually, because it's the next festival to be celebrated. Many of the rituals reenact something that's happening in nature. And what we try to do is to create, it's almost like being able to stand still and reflect on what is actually happening in nature. Now, Beltane is specifically, as we know, spring. At the moment, it's just absolutely bursting with energy, and suddenly it's, you know, completely green. And this is part of our life process of between, you know, conception to actual birth, through to harvesting and finally death. When we look at our rituals, they reflect again those processes in nature. And it's a shame you haven't been able to show this, but May Beltane, who took part in this particular section of the film, the documentary, she also says as well they actually erect the maypole. The men actually bring in the maypole, but it's the women, the female, who takes off the different layers of her gown, and then they, of course, have the ribbons around the pole.
I think we had some images from that before as well. You probably saw that
Yes.
already.
Yeah. And so again, the rituals are in a way one to help people to actually become more aware of the actual forces around them. This month, for example, one of our major influences is also the moon cycle, and today or yesterday is actually the new moon for what we call grass moon. And when I said to people, grasmaand in the Netherlands often celebrated the silly dance that the cows do. And it's a well-known feature in the Dutch, and we say, well, the milk that's produced is actually, grasboter. So what we're trying to do as well is to connect also with the locality. And although Wicca, as we sort of we were initiated in England, and in a way I said, the Wicca has an archetypal basis, but it's so important that everybody involved immediately connects also with their surroundings, because you can only really understand nature and partake when you actually look around and actually see what's happening around you. I mean, how many people follow the lunar cycle, and today unfortunately people look at their mobile telephones first without looking outside to see what's actually happening. So I think it's this disconnectedness with nature, which we try to say to people, you don't have to do very much, just go out and enjoy what's happening, even in the middle of the winter.
Right. So at what moment can you really call yourself a witch? Is that something that you feel and decide for yourself, or is there a specific moment where you are officially a witch? How does that work?
I'm involved in something called initiatory Wicca, and we have this is basically a strand of witchcraft, modern witchcraft, which was really brought into life, if you like, by Gerald Gardner, and I became involved with what we call Gardnerian Wicca. Now, there are also different strands. Alexandrian Wicca is also part of this initiatory way, as we call it as well. Now, to become a Gardnerian or an Alexandrian, there are specific rituals, especially the initiation rituals, which we would consider to be the core of Gardnerian or Alexandrian Wicca. With films like this and various other things that have happened in the 1990s, or well, between the 70s and 90s, but specifically with the advent of internet, the word Wicca took on its own life. Certainly the goddess movement or goddess spirituality in the United States also contributed. So in the end, I actually say to people, in a way, you don't have to be initiated to revere the gods and look at the moon cycle. So I make the difference between initiatory Wicca, which is Gardnerian, Alexandrian specifically. There are a couple of other branches, but those are the main ones, certainly in Europe. But a lot of people have also spent many years also discovering for themselves what the moon cycle means to them. So we saw the advent of many people who would call themselves free witches or hedge witches, which is actually the word huiszussen, heggereden in het Nederlands. And I really, some people would say to me, well, isn't that really annoying, when people take all specific Wicca standards, having a circle, being polytheistic, celebrating the 8 festivals. And I say, actually, no. To me, it's wonderful that Gerald Gardner and many other people, have made it possible for us to reconnect with nature, but also to reconnect with the divine feminine. And I think for many people, men and women, that it's so important that we really begin to understand what, you know, what the goddess is all about, and how the earth, many people today are probably pagan without actually realising it because of our concern about the environment. I think for me, Wicca has helped me to understand really, really what it is about, you know, the seasonal cycle. And so in that sense, I think if anybody wants to call himself a witch, I don't care, as long as you do the stuff, you know. And I think the problem is that, you know, I think there are certainly more things important than arguing whether somebody's got a lineage or, you know, and it frustrates me in a sense, because I think witchcraft, modern witchcraft, Wicca, whatever you want to call it, has a real message for today, and for men and women. I don't think it's just something for women. I think it's helped women to, like we saw again, be empowered. But in the end, I think the reverence for the earth, the recognition of a god and goddess is perhaps the most important. Yeah.
Are there questions from?
Yeah. Any questions?
Otherwise, I have a few still. But
We have a couple of people in the audience who are. I'd just like to point out Alex here. She was very, very instrumental in the animation part of the documentary, and there's also, have you got the copy there?
no, I don't think I have it here.
Oh, there is. We have the which is in Holland, Hexen in Holland, and Jana there is also interviewed. I can't see anybody else at the moment. And put your hand up if you're part of this film. No, anyway.
So there's quite a big group of witches in the Netherlands.
More than there were 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Again, I think a lot of people will call themselves witches, and they're not specifically initiated.
What like if you were talking about the initiation that you are a part of, what sort of things do you do at that moment? I mean, what are those initiation rites that people have to go through?
People will say to me, you know, are you born a witch? And I say, well, when I meet people and they're interested in becoming involved in Wicca, I say you can. I don't believe you can teach witchcraft at all. I can only guide somebody and point out various options. What you can teach, of course, are the techniques of visualization, various other things which will help you to become more adept at magic. And that's basically what, on the one hand, we have a very strong religious aspect, and secondary, in my case, the actual techniques and being able to do the magic is, again, very, very important. So if anybody's kind of interested, we point out that we try to help people, first of all, realise whether it's actually for them, whether the initiatory way is actually for them. Again, people don't need to be initiated if they just want to go and celebrate the moon or moon festivals. When somebody's initiated, it means that we have a specific way of doing things, and so the rituals are specific, and so yeah, if people are interested, then of course it's a question of, well, come and have a chat.
And are those rituals the same for everybody, or is there like a personal difference between the different kind of witches?
The core material, when I was initiated, I said to people, you know, we have something called the Book of Shadows. 40 years ago, my Book of Shadows was something like 12 pages. Today, people have added things, and the core material for Ghanaians and Alexandrians are basically the same. The core rituals are basically the same. But I would like to point out, and I do point out regularly, that one, for me, Wicca is actually organic. And although we have an initiatory line to other people before us, I see that as being part of a family. And as every family has its own rules and regulations and secrets, so each coven is autonomous. So I say when people are initiated, we have, of course, if you're working in a circle, then there has to be an obvious amount of trust between people because things happen. And I always kind of warn people, if you want to follow this particular path, then things are going to happen. And they often do. And then people kind of look at me, oh. But it's kind of sometimes subtle changes, but sometimes it can be huge changes, which is why the changeover is quite important as well in this respect, because it can sometimes be a real jolt. And she comes out of the water, of course. But sometimes it's much more subtle than that. But
And
often,
talking about that subtlety, you just mentioned magic. Well, the word magic is huge. That can be basically anything from traditional movie type witches who just make everything happen, or it can be much more subtle, like you can see in this movie, for instance, where it's more like having dreams and visions and stuff like that. How does that work for you as real witches in this modern time? I mean, it must be weird to see all those different kinds of ideas about magic and witchcraft.
I think the actual perspective of magic has changed. I say for people actually say to me, what is Wicca magic? And I say, actually, as Gerald Gardner himself, he was very, very eclectic. He gathered things from folklore and used many things, many sources. So to me, everybody has to find out their actual forte. Some people will find earth magic or what we call low magic, their forte. Some people...
Can you give an example of that?
Well, earth magic, where one would actually follow the moon cycle much more closely than perhaps somebody who is into ceremonial magic, which is much more ritualistic in the sense of attributes with planetary attributes and various other things. Specifically, things like the Kabbalah will come into play. The Western mystery way is also part of the what I would call the ceremonial magic side. Renaissance magic has played a huge role. Enochian magic from John Dee has been expanded in the last 20, 30 years, 40 years. Chaos magic has played a huge role as well in changing. Chaos magic being not specifically the magicians themselves are chaotic, but the world is chaos and random. So there's very different ways of learning how to understand these particular forces and how to become adept. So in that sense, when people ask me what Wicca magic is all about, I say actually you need to know a lot of things. So you have to learn a lot of things, but you also have to understand, if you're doing magic and healing magic specifically, it's always important to understand the mindset of the person you're working for. If a Christian sort of says, God help me, then I have to understand what is God for a Christian. So when I'm doing magical work for a Christian, I try to figure out how they will receive the energy that is actually being sent to them to help them become healthy.
So energy is sort of the key word here, I think.
Yeah, I think for me, in my experience is that I was absolutely fascinated by quantum physics. In fact, Peter Carroll, one of the most well-known chaos magicians, is also a quantum physicist. And he, again, when I started looking at his work, it was made me realise that magic, like quantum physics, is something, it's either energy or information, and it can be both. And it's up to you as being able to use the energy. Am I actually transmitting information, or am I sending energy, or am I doing both? And I think at that point, I know the classic definition of magic is to change things at one's will, I think the Aleister Crowley, but to me that is actually not large enough. I'm not saying that I'm better than Aleister Crowley, but hey, why not? But I think that's the point. This is actually evolving. So what Aleister Crowley talked about, or what John Dee talked about, doesn't necessarily mean to say that it hasn't actually evolved. And I think it's almost our duty when I took my oath, It was to understand not just the natural world, but to understand the cosmos, and to try in my own mind to figure out, one, what the gods are telling me, but also what is my potential. So I think this idea of magic, it's almost like saying nothing is impossible, but we just have to help people to change their perspective.
Right, nice. I think that's a good note to end this part on, especially since it all connects back to the changeover which we just saw. I'd like to thank you for this moment. We'll take a break of, I think, about 15 to 20 minutes. And then we'll come back here to talk a bit about the history of magic and to introduce Hakazusa to you, which is a very different movie from this one, I can say. Really beautiful. So I hope you'll join us for that. If not, thank you for being here for now, and hopefully see you later at the festival. A movie that takes place in Austria in the 15th century. Can you first tell me a bit about, well, let's say in general, the waves that witchcraft went through from the beginning until now? I mean, that's a big thing, but...
Yeah, generally speaking, yeah, witchcraft, we're just talking about the burning. It's
Yeah.
often referred to the
Yeah.
burning times, yeah.
Burning times and well,
Yeah.
throwing witches into the sea and stuff like that.
Yeah, what people don't. There was recently, let me put it in perspective. There was a recent exhibition in Utrecht in 2015 to 2016 called Heksen van Breugel. And it was fascinating, actually. It was a fascinating exhibition. If you go to Catharina Convent in Utrecht, there's probably still have the guide there. Buy it, because it really, really shows you how Breugel, Peter Breugel the Elder, used a little monogram of, well, two actually, of an old woman on a broomstick. And he thought this was fascinating. So he incorporated it into his drawings. Then people picked it up. His pictures were very much a part of sort of like a newspaper.
And which period was this?
I think it was 16th century. The point being that the Heksen van Breugel exhibition really, really dealt with the whole of the persecution of the witches as well. We have to remember that it was actually the Inquisition, which was started in Spain, in Seville, was actually out for heretics. Anybody who was not in agreement with the church, and anybody who was kind of different or against the church would be branded as being a heretic. But that also started including a number of other people who were not quite in accord with the church. Many feminists still hold on to the idea that the Burning Times was responsible for killing 9 million women, mainly women. This is far from the truth. The truth was that the Inquisition really branded a number of people. So what we actually saw happen, I think it was this idea that anything or anybody who was against the doctrine of the church could understand Latin or ancient Greek or anything, could actually question what was actually in the Bible. And this started again, you're talking about Luther at the time, the printing presses. And there are social waves where if people start seeing things happening which, the milk goes sour, somebody has to be blamed. And I think a lot of what was happening was, there is this word scapegoat in English. And I think what you often see is people are accused and blamed for things that, are actual natural causes. One of the things that Breugel saw as well, there was a connection between the Little Ice Age, which was in the Netherlands, and all these beautiful 16th century paintings you see of people skating on was actually a natural phenomenon. But if people are really starving, then somebody has to be blamed. And I see this happening so often, whether it was Germany or whether it was England or Spain. But the main persecution of witches wasn't actually in the Netherlands. One of the things that happened in the Netherlands was in Oudewater, there was a story of the young girl, sorry, who was accused of witchcraft. Again, the milk was sour. And I think she saw, I think it was Willem de Derde, Stadthouden in an event on his horse, and he was coming, and she begged him to say, you know, that she wasn't a witch. And he suggested that she would be weighed on the council, you know, the markets and weighing scales that were used for cattle and vegetables and what have you. And he said that if, you know, as we know, witches are lighter than feathers, so if she was in proportion, if her weight was in proportion to her height, then she was obviously not a witch. And he actually signed the certificate. That was actually worth its weight in gold because it meant a lot of the witch, so-called people in the Netherlands accused of witchcraft could actually say that, you know, they had a proof that they weren't. So the witch persecutions in the Netherlands wasn't as bad as it was in Germany. But here again, so what you saw happening in Austria with Hagazusa, again, if things go wrong, people are blamed. And you see this in this film as well, that there's always somebody in the village who's slightly different or lives at the edge. But that person, often a woman, not always, but often a woman, knew how herbs worked or could help people if they had toothache and the medical, you know, the doctors at the time were really didn't know that much at all. And it was actually the herborists who did know which plants were poisonous and which plants were not poisonous. So again, there was always this, usually an older woman who you could go to if you were feeling ill, despite the fact that maybe there was a doctor around. So you have this idea of the wise woman. In English we also have these words, cunning men and cunning women, and they were able to, you know, not just predict things as in fortune, but they would sort of say, well, if you do this, then that's going to happen. But of course the church would not really appreciate that, and I think this has been the problem, that the patriarchal, I don't think it's Christianity so much, but it's the way the church reacted to new changes. And as soon as people could read, as we saw with Tyndale, he translated the Bible into English, and he also lost his life. It's dangerous, it's dangerous. And one of the things about witches have become an archetype for danger, and we see in fairy tales, it's also this idea of the bogeyman or something which we don't understand. And I think this is today so relevant because, you know, we still talk about witch hunts, but the idea of a witch is to me, and that was one of the reasons why I enjoyed still saying, you know, using the word witch, is because one it doesn't have a gender. Most people think it's all going to be women, but one of the things I realised was as well this idea of a witch that could move between the worlds, and this, you see this now in the film, you're going to see this ability to sometimes use the herbs, and we know about the flying ointment, but often using certain substances to travel, we don't know. You know, it's always this idea, we're not quite sure, and these people who are able to, you know, again, we hear about shamans who are able to travel, make these inner journeys, and I think there have always been these kind of people around, and for anybody who's got a doctrine, they are dangerous.
But you also see often in stories that there's like good and bad witches. How does that pan out in the real world?
I think there's, again, because the archetype witch has been associated with evil, and of course in the Bible it was the Witch of Endor, was a bad translation or mistranslation of gifmengster, or somebody who knows about poisons. There is always this fear, and it's again not quite knowing that is really the difficult part. So
So you don't have like the Wizard of Oz kind of like the good witch and the bad witch, and they're against each other, and I mean that's sort of the really traditional broomstick witches that we've seen for ages.
yeah, it was funny actually. One of the links you sent me was from I can't remember her name now. There's a lovely video clip looking at movies and how the archetype of the witch has changed from Sleeping Beauty to Witch of Oz. And she actually said that most of these films, apart from there's one which was written by a woman, Bewitched, the series Bewitched, was actually written by a woman, and all the rest have been written by men. So you get to see whether men do it purposely or not. There is still this idea that they can't quite understand what women are up to, really. But again, you know, we have in English, we have this word witch, but we also have this word bewitched. And one of the things that I think is important is for everybody to understand what it really means to fall under this sense of glamoury. Today we have social media, advertising, which makes good use, whether it's subliminal or not, but to actually awaken this idea of an illusion. That's my name, Morgana. You know, you have the idea of a mirage, fathomable one. And I think this is one thing that we don't always realise that works on all of us, and whether Trump calls it fake news or whatever. It's nothing new. We've always had people, or we want to create something to influence people. Let's put it that way.
Let's get back to Hagazusa for a bit before we start with the movie itself. Can you explain a bit about the types of people and the images that you see in there? Because we talked about this before together, that the director of this movie, he made it as his final project for film school, which is quite amazing. When you see it, you'll see what I mean. But he has definitely been really doing his research. So can you explain a bit about what we'll see and what is in there that is based on true facts and true stories?
Yeah, I mean the title, as we were just saying, Hagazusa is a Germanic word. In Dutch we have Hegerrede. In Dutch we have the word hedge, which literally means sitting or standing, or I suppose sitting on a hedge between. It's a boundary. It's a boundary, and I think what a lot of the we could call them wise. If you imagine a long time ago that people would see the moon, partake in moon magic, and the powers we talked in the first part about the powers of the moon, which in both films are very, very important, and the power of water. In this film as well, you'll see how the water has this power. It's a very, we associate it with emotions, but it also, without water we can't really exist. But it also has this, again for the church, it also has this really great power of consecration, of cleaning. But it can also drown you, it can overwhelm you. So I think what this film, why the director, I think he had, or I knew enough about the subconscious, and if you're looking for a way of really exploring psychologically the subconscious, then this idea of the Hegerrede, between the worlds, is excellent. I mean, he really has done his homework. Set in, I mean, when the film starts, you're not aware that it's actually in Austria, but I saw a couple of characters which reminded me of something called Krampus, which is very much part of Austria and the southern part of Germany and Switzerland. And I started clicking that, oh, this must be Austria, and I guess it's kind of, you don't really know. But the whole thing is so archetypal, and when you're actually looking at the film, you actually talk about being bewitched. You're drawn into, it's very hypnotic, and there's a point where you're actually not realising whether you're in a kind of inner journey yourself. So I think that he really has done his homework as far as being able to create a panorama or yeah, it's very different than the first film we saw,
Yeah.
but because it's an experience before you realise what's happening. But I don't want to be a spoiler for this, but just let yourself go with it.
Yeah. Can you, to round up and then we'll start the movie, is there anything specific about Hagasusa, without spoiling too much, that you can help the audience with, like, have like an extra interest in, or a scene or some moment that you can shed some light on that they can look at?
As I say, the real, when I finished seeing the film, I thought there are parts of it when you're not sure whether it's real or whether you're imagining it, and it suddenly made me realise that you come away thinking, when are things not real or dreams? And it really is, the way she's treated as well, it's almost like saying to everybody, be discerning, question what you're actually seeing, but also have this, don't fall back on or it's like, are you being brainwashed? So it really starts making you think about your own surroundings. And this story is like, it's in the 15th, I think it's the 15th century. In that sense, psychologically, we haven't changed, and we're still susceptible to this power of bewitchment.
Right. Okay, thank you very much for being here and giving this introduction. Thank you for listening to us, and I hope you will enjoy this beautiful movie. Thank you.